I want to tell you about the year our homeowners association decided I owned a dog that never existed because I think there is something almost everyone over the age of 40 will recognize in it, that particular helplessness that comes not from being wronged by a person you can argue with, but from being wronged by a system that simply refuses to look at what is right in front of it. We had lived in that neighborhood for 11 years by the time the first letter arrived. A quiet little subdivision outside of Charlotte, with brick mailboxes and a homeowners association that mostly concerned itself with the height of hedges and the color people were allowed to paint their front doors. And in all that time, we had never once received so much as a warning notice. Not for the mailbox that leaned a little to the left after a storm. Not for the year we let the grass go longer than it should have, while my wife was recovering from her knee surgery. Nothing, because we were the kind of people who paid our dues on time and kept to ourselves and figured that was enough to be left alone. Before any of this began, our life in that neighborhood had settled into the kind of quiet, unremarkable rhythm that I think most people spend their whole lives hoping to find mornings where my wife walked out to get the newspaper in her robe and complained about the price of gas to whichever neighbor happened to be doing the same thing. Evenings where the whole street smelled like someone's grill. Going weekends spent trimming hedges and comparing tomato plants over the low fence that separated our yard from the Hendersons next door. And I bring this up not because it matters to the sequence of events, but because I want you to understand what kind of ordinary life this whole ordeal reached into and disrupted, because it is one thing to imagine a bureaucratic nightmare happening to a stranger in a news story, and it is another thing entirely to have it happen inside the small familiar routine of your own front porch. We had two dogs, and I say that plainly because it matters to everything that follows a 12-year-old pug named Otis, who by that point in his life mostly slept on the porch and wheezed his way through short walks around the block in a small, scruffy, mixed breed we had adopted from a shelter 3 years earlier named Peanut, who the shelter had listed as a Chihuahua mix and who weighed on a good day with a full stomach perhaps 9 pounds. Neither of these dogs had ever bitten anyone. Neither had ever so much as growled at the mail carrier. And if you had lined up every dog in that neighborhood by how much of a threat they posed to public safety, ours would have been somewhere near the very bottom of the list, right below the elderly retriever, 3 doors down, who could barely make it to the end of his own driveway. So when the letter came printed on the association's usual letterhead, with its little pine tree logo in the corner, informing us that we were in violation of the community's restricted breed policy for harboring what it called an American Pit Bull Terrier, my first reaction was not anger, it was confusion. The kind of confusion you feel when someone hands you a piece of mail addressed to a stranger and insists it is yours. I actually laughed a little when I read it out loud to my wife at the kitchen table, the two of us sitting there with our coffee going cold, while Otis snored on the rug beside us, and Peanut sat in my wife's lap watching us with the mild curiosity dogs have when they sense something is happening but cannot tell what. And my wife looked at the letter and then looked down at Peanut, who at that moment weighed perhaps a pound less than the coffee mug in front of her, and said, "Well, I suppose we should be flattered someone thinks our dog looks that intimidating." And we both laughed about it. In the easy way you laugh at something you are certain will be resolved within the hour, because it seems so obviously like a clerical mistake. The kind of thing that happens when someone types a house number wrong or pulls the wrong file from a stack. And I remember saying something like, "Well, someone is going to feel silly when they realize their mistake." And I picked up the phone that same afternoon, fully expecting a 2-minute conversation would clear the whole thing up. The woman who answered at the management company's office was polite in the practiced way that people are polite when they have said the same sentences 100 times before. And she told me the violation had been logged based on a complaint filed by a resident, and that the complaint described a large aggressive dog matching pit bull characteristics being walked from our address. And I told her as calmly as I could manage that we did not own a pit bull, that we owned a 12-year-old pug who could barely climb our porch steps, and a 9-pound rescue mutt who spent most of his time hiding under the coffee table. When the doorbell rang and she said in a tone that I would come to know very well over the following months that she understood my concern, but that the matter would need to go through the association's official review process. I want to be fair here because I think it is easy in the retelling of a story like this to make everyone on the other side sound cartoonish. And that is not what happened. Not at first, the woman on the phone was not cruel. She was simply a person following a procedure that did not have a box on the form for "I don't own the dog you're describing." And so she took down my information and told me someone would be in touch. And I hung up the phone feeling mildly annoyed but not yet worried because surely I thought common sense would prevail once someone actually looked at the situation. A week later, a second letter arrived, and this one was not a warning. This one informed us that the violation remained unresolved and that fines had begun accruing at a rate of $50 per day, retroactive to the date of the original complaint, which meant that in the 7 days since I had spoken to that woman on the phone and calmly explained that no such dog existed, we had already accumulated several $100s in penalties for an animal that had never once set foot on our property. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like something closer to a small, slow-motion nightmare. The kind where you are perfectly capable of proving the truth, but somehow the proving of it does not seem to matter to the people who are supposed to be listening. I did what I imagine most reasonable people would do at that point, which is to say I tried to solve the problem through the normal channels available to me before I let myself get angry about it. Because anger, I have learned over the years, tends to make people stop listening to you even faster than they were already not listening in the first place. I took photographs of both dogs that same afternoon. Clear close-up pictures of Otis and Peanut standing side by side on our back patio. And I emailed them to the management company, along with a polite letter explaining again that we had never owned any breed that could reasonably be described as a pit bull. And I attached for good measure a printout of Peanut's adoption paperwork from the shelter, which listed his breed as Chihuahua Mix in the same clinical, unremarkable language you would expect from a government form. The response, when it finally came almost 2 weeks later, was not a resolution. It was an acknowledgement that my email had been received and forwarded to the Architectural Review Committee for consideration at their next scheduled meeting. And I remember reading that sentence 3 times, trying to understand how a photograph of a 9-pound dog standing next to a wheezing pug required a committee meeting to interpret. And I could not find an answer because there wasn't one. There was only a process, and the process did not appear to care whether the underlying claim was true. In the weeks leading up to that first committee meeting, I found myself doing something I am slightly embarrassed to admit now, which was rehearsing in my head exactly what I would say if given the chance to speak, arranging and rearranging the same handful of facts, as though the right combination of words might finally cut through whatever it was that kept this from resolving itself. And I remember mentioning this to my wife one night, and her laughing gently, not unkindly, and saying that the problem was never going to be our choice of words, because we had already used all the right words. The problem was that nobody with the authority to act had actually sat down and read them yet. By the time that committee meeting actually happened, another month had passed. Another 30 days of fines had accumulated on top of the ones already sitting there. And when the decision finally arrived in our mailbox, it did not say the violation had been dismissed. It said the committee had reviewed the submitted materials and determined that additional verification would be required before any fines could be reconsidered. And it asked without a hint of irony that we provide documentation proving the current ownership status of any dogs at our address, as though the photographs and adoption papers I had already sent had simply evaporated somewhere between my inbox and theirs. That was when we decided to bring in a lawyer, not because we thought the situation had become some grand legal battle, but because after 2 months of getting nowhere through polite persistence, it seemed like the only way to be taken seriously was to have someone with a law degree say the same things I had already been saying in a letter with a firm's letterhead at the top of it. Our attorney, a calm and unhurried man named Walter, who had handled a property dispute for us years earlier when a contractor left a job half finished, was the kind of lawyer who never seemed to raise his voice about anything. And when I called him that first time to explain the situation, laying out the whole strange sequence of events from the original letter to the committee's request for documentation we had already provided, he listened without interrupting and then said simply that he had seen this kind of thing before associations getting locked into a process that generated its own momentum, regardless of the underlying facts, and that the fastest way through it was usually not outrage, but persistence delivered on official letterhead, because official letterhead, whatever else you could say about it, tended to get read by someone slightly higher up the chain than a homeowner's email ever would. He wrote a letter that laid it all out plainly that we did not own a pit bull, that we had provided photographic and documentary evidence of the 2 dogs actually residing at our home, that the fines had no legal basis absent a verified violation, and that we expected the association to reverse the accumulated penalties and provide the original complaint on which the entire matter had been based, since at no point had anyone told us who had filed it or when they claimed to have seen this dog. I remember feeling when that letter went out, A kind of relief that I had not felt in weeks, the sense that surely now with a lawyer's name attached to the correspondence, someone would finally sit down and actually look at what we had sent them, rather than simply moving our file to the next stage of a process that seemed designed to never actually conclude. That relief lasted exactly as long as it took for the association's own attorney to respond, which was almost a month, and when the response came, it did not address a single piece of evidence we had submitted. It simply restated that the fines remained in effect, pending resolution through the association's internal dispute procedure. And it noted almost as an afterthought that the original complaint had come from a resident whose identity the association was not obligated to disclose under the terms of its governing documents. I sat with that sentence for a long time after I read it, because it meant that somewhere in our neighborhood someone had looked at our house, or perhaps had simply looked at nothing at all and made an assumption and had filed a report describing an animal that did not exist, and the entire weight of proving a negative had fallen on us, while the person who had started it all got to remain invisible, protected by a policy that seemed to exist specifically to prevent us from ever knowing who they were or why they had done it. By that point, the fines had climbed past $4,000, and I would be lying if I said the money did not weigh on us. But honestly, it was not the dollar figure that kept me up at night. It was the sheer strangeness of being punished for something that was demonstrably provably false, and having every reasonable attempt to demonstrate that falseness simply absorbed into a process that never seemed to require anyone to actually answer the question of whether the dog in question was real. My wife, who has always been more even-tempered than I am about these kinds of things, started to wonder out loud whether this was personal, whether someone in the neighborhood had a grudge against us that we simply were not aware of. And I told her I did not think that was likely, because we had never had so much as a heated word with any of our neighbors in 11 years. But the truth is that once that thought enters your mind, it is very hard to get it back out. And I found myself looking at people at the mailboxes a little differently after that, wondering without any real evidence who among them might have started this. Word of what was happening to us traveled through the neighborhood in the slow, informal way these things always do, not because we went around telling people, but because Walter's letters were a matter of public record at the association level. And before long, a couple of neighbors mentioned almost in passing at the mailbox or during a Saturday morning walk that they had heard the association was giving us trouble over a dog. And one of them, a retired school teacher named Ruth, who lived 2 streets over, told me quietly one afternoon that she had gone through something similar herself a few years earlier. A dispute over a fence height that had dragged on for the better part of a year before the association simply let it drop without ever formally resolving it. And she said the thing she remembered most was not the argument itself, but the exhaustion of it, the sense that the process itself was the punishment, regardless of who was actually right, and hearing her say that out loud. A woman I barely knew, nodding along with something I had assumed was uniquely absurd to our own situation, made me realize this was less an isolated mistake and more a pattern baked into how these disputes tended to unfold. The financial pressure of it crept up on us in a way that was almost harder to describe than the frustration, because it was never one single overwhelming number. It was the slow drip of watching a total climb week after week on a piece of paper past $1,000, past $5,000, past the point where either of us could pretend it was some abstract bureaucratic error that would simply sort itself out. And there were a few uncomfortable conversations at our kitchen table about what we would actually do if it came to that, whether we would have to draw against savings we had set aside for other things. And I remember my wife saying more than once that it was not the money itself that bothered her so much as the principle of paying even a single dollar towards something that was in the plainest possible sense untrue. That is where the story sat for a long stretch of the summer, fines accumulating, letters going back and forth between our attorney and theirs, each one restating positions that had already been stated until eventually the amount owed crossed $20,000. And I remember the afternoon I opened that particular statement and simply set it down on the counter and stood there for a minute. Not because I believed we would actually have to pay it, but because it is a strange and unsettling thing to hold a piece of paper that says you owe $20,000 for a crime that, as far as anyone could tell, had never actually happened. It was around that same time that we decided to install a security camera above our garage, and I want to be honest that this was not some clever strategic maneuver on our part. It was simply a practical decision born out of exhaustion, the same instinct that makes you keep receipts after a store has shorted your change. Once we had grown tired of a situation where our word, Our photographs and our documentation all seemed to count for nothing. And we thought that if the association was going to insist, a large aggressive dog was regularly walked from our address, then a continuously running camera pointed at our own driveway would either confirm or deny that claim in a way nobody could argue with. We did not expect it to change anything quickly, and for the first several weeks it did not. The camera simply recorded Otis being carried out to the yard because his hips had gotten too stiff for him to manage the porch steps on his own, and Peanut trotting along beside him on his leash, and the mail carrier coming and going, and our neighbors walking their own dogs past the house. None of them anything close to a pit bull, all of it sitting quietly on a hard drive, while the correspondence with the association continued to circle in the same exhausting loop it had been stuck in for months. There is a particular kind of patience required to sit through weeks of footage that shows nothing at all happening. And I want to be honest that there were evenings that summer when I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through hours of grainy driveway video, watching Otis take his slow, careful steps down to the grass and back, watching Peanut chase the same squirrel that seemed to live permanently in the oak tree at the edge of our yard, watching the UPS driver come and go, watching absolutely nothing that resembled the animal described in that original complaint. And there is something almost meditative about that kind of tedium when you know exactly why you are enduring it, because every uneventful hour of footage was in its own quiet way. One more piece of proof stacking up in our favor, even if no one on the other end of our correspondence seemed interested in looking at it yet. My wife started keeping a simple log alongside the footage, a notebook where she jotted down the date in a line or two describing whatever had happened in the yard that day. Nothing dramatic, just a record. Otis struggled with the steps again. Today had to carry him down. Peanut got into the flower bed and tracked mulch across the porch. And looking back, I think that notebook mattered less for its content than for what keeping it did for us. It gave us something to do with our frustration, besides simply waiting for someone else to act. And there is a particular kind of relief in having a task, however small, when the larger situation feels entirely out of your hands. What finally broke that loop was not a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of a very ordinary kind of evidence over a very ordinary length of time. Weeks of continuous footage that showed without a single gap exactly which animals came and went from our property, and when our attorney finally requested for what felt like the 10th time an in-person meeting with the association's board, rather than another exchange of letters between lawyers, they agreed to it. And I think in hindsight that was the moment things actually started to move. Not because we threatened anything or raised our voices, but because we were finally sitting across a table from the people who had the actual authority to end this, rather than corresponding with a management company whose job seemed to be absorbing complaints rather than resolving them. I remember walking into that meeting with a folder that had grown embarrassingly thick over the preceding months. The original photographs of Otis and Peanut, the shelter paperwork, copies of every letter we had sent and every letter we had received, and a flash drive containing several weeks of unedited camera footage, time-stamped and organized by date. And I remember thinking as I sat down at that long table across from 5 board members I had lived near for over a decade, but had never really spoken to that. This was the first time in the entire ordeal that we were being given the chance to simply lay everything out in front of actual human beings rather than mailing it into a process. Our attorney did most of the talking calmly and without any particular heat in his voice, walking through the timeline exactly as it had happened. The original complaint, our immediate response, the photographs, the shelter records, the months of silence and delay, and then he played a selection of the camera footage on a laptop, weeks compressed down into a few representative clips. Otis being helped down the steps, Peanut trotting along on his leash, the two of them together on the patio, and at no point in any of it, anything remotely resembling the dog described in that original complaint. I watched the faces of the board members while that footage played, and what I remember most clearly was not shock or embarrassment on their part. It was something quieter, the particular discomfort of people realizing that a process they had trusted to function correctly had simply never actually verified the thing. It was supposed to verify that somewhere back at the very beginning, someone had accepted a complaint at face value and set an entire machine of fines and letters and committee reviews into motion without a single person ever asking the obvious question of whether the dog being described actually existed. One of the board members, an older man who I later learned had only joined the board a few months into the whole ordeal and had inherited the file, rather than created it, asked quietly whether anyone had ever gone back to look at the original complaint itself. And there was a long pause before the property manager admitted that the complaint had been handled by an employee who no longer worked for the company, and that the original written report, if it still existed at all, would need to be located in older files. That admission, more than anything, our attorney said, seemed to be the turning point in the room because it made visible something I had suspected for months, but had never been able to prove, which was that this entire ordeal had never really been about verifying a fact. It had been about a process moving forward on its own momentum. Letter generating letter fine, generating fine, with no one along the way ever circling back to ask the simple question that would have ended everything on day one. There was a long silence in the room after that admission, the kind of silence where you can tell several people are recalculating something in their heads at once. And one of the younger board members, a woman who ran a small accounting practice out of her home, a few streets from ours, finally said that regardless of what had happened to the original paperwork, what mattered now was sitting in front of them on the laptop screen, and that she did not see how the association could continue defending fines built on a complaint nobody could even locate anymore. And I remember feeling for the first time in almost a year that someone in an official capacity was actually speaking on our behalf, rather than simply managing us through a procedure. The board voted that same afternoon unanimously to rescind the fines in full and to formally close the violation as unfounded. And they agreed to send a written statement confirming that no evidence had ever substantiated the original complaint, which our attorney told us afterward was important not because we intended to do anything further with it, but simply because it meant the record would finally reflect the truth rather than an unresolved accusation. I wish I could tell you there was some dramatic confrontation after that, some moment where the neighbor who filed the original complaint was identified and made to answer for it, but that is not how it ended. And honestly, I have made a kind of peace with that because the association's governing documents never did require them to disclose who had filed it. And by the time the fines were reversed, I found that my anger towards some unknown, unseen accuser had faded into something closer to tiredness. A simple wish to be done with the whole thing rather than a need to see it end in some satisfying confrontation. We never did find out who made the original complaint, and there were moments standing at the mailboxes on a quiet evening when I would find myself looking at one neighbor or another and wondering. But I stopped chasing that thought eventually because I realized it was not going to give me anything back that the resolution itself had not already given me, which was simply the fines gone and the truth finally written down somewhere official. What stayed with me longer than the money or the frustration was something quieter. The memory of all those months spent explaining a simple, obvious fact to a system that seemed structurally uninterested in hearing it. The photographs that did not matter until they were shown on a laptop in a room full of people with the authority to act on them. The shelter paperwork that sat in an email for months without anyone apparently opening it. And I think that is the part of this story that I suspect a lot of people will recognize, not the specific details of dogs and fines, but that particular weary feeling of being right, and finding that being right is not always enough on its own to be believed. In the weeks after the board's decision, life on our street simply resumed its old shape. The same grills going on Saturday evenings, the same conversations about lawn fungus and gas prices, the same wave from across the yard as neighbors came and went, and there was something almost anticlimactic about how quickly the ordinary rhythm swallowed the whole ordeal back up, as though nearly a year of letters and fines and committee meetings had been a strange detour rather than a permanent scar on the place we lived. And I think that surprised me more than anything else, how a thing that had occupied so much of our attention for so long could simply stop mattering to everyone else the moment it was resolved. Ruth, the retired teacher from 2 streets over, stopped me one afternoon, not long after, and asked how everything had turned out. And when I told her the fines had been reversed, she nodded in a way that suggested she was not at all surprised either by the outcome or by how long it had taken to get there. And she said something I have thought about many times since, that these associations are not run by bad people so much as they are run by a process that nobody ever goes back and checks, and that the only thing that ever seems to break the cycle is someone refusing to give up before the process runs out of excuses. We kept the camera up long after everything was settled, not out of any lingering suspicion, but simply because it had become part of the routine of the house. A small, quiet presence above the garage door. And I think in some ways it became a kind of symbol for us of that whole strange year, proof that the truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply sits there patiently, recording an ordinary life, one uneventful day at a time, waiting for someone to finally take the time to look. These days, Otis has passed on. He lived to be 14, a good long life for a pug, and he is buried under the dogwood tree at the edge of our backyard, right where he used to nap in the afternoon sun. And Peanut is older now, too, gray around his little muzzle. Slower on his walks than he used to be, but he still trots along the same stretch of driveway where that camera used to run day and night. And some evenings, I sit out on the porch with a cup of tea and watch him sniffing around the flower beds, unbothered by any of it. And I think about that folder full of papers that used to sit on our kitchen counter, thick with photographs and shelter records and letters from two different lawyers, and how strange it is that something so absurd, a fine for a dog that never existed, could take up nearly a year of our lives before it finally quietly ended. Not with anyone admitting fault in any dramatic way, not with an apology or a confrontation with whoever started it, but simply with a board meeting, a laptop, and a truth that had been sitting there the entire time, patient and unremarkable, waiting for someone to actually look. And I suppose if there is anything I would want another person going through something similar to take from all of this, it would simply be that being right is rarely enough on its own, but being right and refusing to stop saying so quietly, patiently, one letter and one photograph and one uneventful hour of driveway footage at a time, eventually does tend to win out, even when it takes far longer than it reasonably should.